A king who blew so much cash on mirrors that his own people chopped his head off. A country that went bankrupt betting on flowers. And a spy who sold out $1 billion secret operation for less than a used Honda. These are 32 of the most expensive mistakes ever made. And somehow every single one of them is real. 1. Back in the 1690s, Scotland was tired of living in England's shadow and desperately wanted to prove it could play empire too. Their master plan was called the Darien Scheme. Plant a colony right in the middle of Panama's swamps and build a trade route connecting two oceans. Scots were so fired up with national pride that they poured a staggering share of the entire country's wealth into this one bet. When the colonists finally landed, they found a steaming jungle crawling with mosquitoes, disease, and very angry Spanish soldiers who were already there. Malaria and yellow fever ripped through the settlers like wildfire. The colony collapsed in humiliating fashion, and Scotland went completely bankrupt. They were left so financially shattered that the only way out was signing the Act of Union with England, essentially trading their independence for a financial rescue package. One roll of the dice, and they lost the whole country. 2. After spending their treasury dry on expensive wars, Britain decided to squeeze some cash out of their American colonists to cover the tab. The brilliant strategy? Slap a modest tax on tea. Back in London, this probably seemed like totally sensible accounting. Across the Atlantic, however, the reaction was volcanic. It was never really about a few pennies on a cup of tea. It was about being bossed around by a government sitting thousands of miles away. So the colonists responded in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. A bunch of guys threw on ridiculous disguises, crept onto ships under the cover of darkness, and hurled an entire fortune of imported tea straight into Boston Harbor. What started as Britain's casual attempt to balance the books ended up costing them an entire continent. Easily the most expensive cup of tea nobody ever got to drink. 3. Picture an ancient emperor who decided his navy needed a floating fortress so heavily armored that nothing on Earth could scratch it. The result was a legendary vessel known as a turtle ship, a massive warship covered from bow to stern in thick iron plating. It looked like a furious steel tortoise crawling across the water, ready to headbutt anything in its path. The fatal flaw, though, was painfully obvious. All that armor made the thing weigh an absurd amount. It moved through the water at the pace of a tired snail dragging a boulder. Nimble enemy ships could literally circle it at full speed while the crew inside just watched helplessly. Instead of an unstoppable war machine, they got a giant, expensive floating paperweight. Living proof that being invincible means nothing if you cannot actually move. 4. Here is a scenario. You hire a massive crew of dangerous, heavily armed mercenaries to handle a messy job. They pull it off, and then you casually mention you cannot actually pay them. In 1203, a Byzantine prince cut a deal with the Knights of the Fourth Crusade, thousands of armed and broke Europeans looking for a paycheck. He promised them a fortune in gold if they helped him reclaim his throne. The Crusaders loved that deal. They stormed Constantinople, one of the most fortified cities on Earth, and installed the prince as emperor. Then came the moment of truth. The brand new emperor checked the treasury, found it empty, and basically tried to ghost an entire army. These were not people you ghosted. The furious Crusaders unleashed 3 straight days of looting and destruction on the richest city in Christendom. The Byzantine Empire never truly recovered, all because one man made a promise his bank account could never keep. 5. In the middle of the Cold War, the CIA cooked up an operation straight from the pages of a spy thriller. They knew the Soviets relied on underwater cables to transmit top-secret communications, so they launched a mission called Project Argonaut. They took a nuclear submarine, outfitted it with cutting-edge surveillance gear, and sent it deep beneath the ocean to secretly tap into those Soviet cables. It worked brilliantly, delivering a goldmine of intelligence. But here is where the whole thing falls apart. An analyst at the NSA named Ronald Pelton, buried under personal debt, walked into a Soviet embassy and sold out the entire operation. His asking price for one of America's most expensive and sensitive intelligence programs? A pathetic $35,000. Hundreds of millions in technology and planning, handed to the enemy for less than the cost of a mid-range sedan. 6. Picture 15th century Florence deciding to blow a fortune commissioning a pair of grand bronze doors for its famous baptistery. We are talking a budget that could make a Medici banker sweat. The city brought in top-tier sculptors, melted down enormous quantities of bronze, rigged up massive cranes and elaborate pulley systems, and somehow still ended up with doors so absurdly heavy that no amount of human effort could actually open them. 6 of the strongest blacksmiths in Tuscany working together could not budge the things an inch. It was like trying to push a loaded cargo ship with a broom handle. Every clever fix they attempted, extra grease, thicker ropes, hiring even stronger workers, just burned through more money at an embarrassing rate. Those legendary doors of destiny became the most expensive decorative deadweight in Renaissance history. Magnificent, immovable, and completely useless. 7. Howard Hughes, eccentric billionaire and aviation fanatic, looked at wartime shipping problems during World War II and had a perfectly rational thought. Build a flying boat roughly the size of a football field. The result was the H-4 Hercules, better known as the Spruce Goose, constructed almost entirely out of wood because wartime steel was off-limits. After dumping millions into the project, close to $250 million in today's money, Hughes finally got the thing off the water in November 1947. One small detail. The war had been over for 2 years. He flew it exactly 1 mile at an altitude of about 30 feet before it touched back down and never lifted off again. It was like spending your life savings building the world's greatest sled, only to finish it in July. The Goose spent the rest of its days parked in a hangar, a beautiful wooden monument to solving yesterday's problem tomorrow. 8. In the early 20th century, France looked at the vast emptiness of the Sahara Desert and somehow concluded it was missing a futuristic trolley network. Not a simple railroad. That would be too boring. They envisioned something called a sea on wheels, an electric monorail suspended from a massive overhead cable stretching hundreds of miles across open desert. It was supposed to be a high-speed express cutting through the sand dunes like a vision from some far-off century. Millions were poured into research, engineering studies, and prototype designs. The engineers probably spent years staring at blueprints, trying to figure out how to stop hundreds of miles of exposed cable from being swallowed by sandstorms every other Tuesday. Spoiler, they never figured it out. The entire project crumbled under the sheer weight of its own impracticality, a spectacularly expensive answer to a question absolutely nobody had asked. 9. In the late 18th century, Britain caught full-blown canal fever. Everyone wanted to dig one. It was the tech startup mania of its day. A group of eager investors decided to build the Salisbury and Southampton Canal, a 23-mile waterway connecting their city to the coast. Their critical mistake was hiring a lead engineer who turned out to be a spectacular fraud, the kind of guy whose credentials probably came from a pamphlet he printed himself. This man designed a tunnel that caved in almost immediately. He built aqueducts that leaked so aggressively they functioned more like outdoor shower systems. The entire construction was a rolling disaster from start to finish. When the canal finally opened after burning through a fortune, it could barely hold water for a full afternoon before draining itself dry. Almost nobody used it. It quickly earned the nickname the Dead Canal, a long, soggy trench standing as an eternal warning about what happens when you hire based on price instead of competence. 10. In 1942, a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike walked into a military meeting with one of the wildest ideas in the history of warfare: build an aircraft carrier out of ice. Not regular ice, though. A special mixture of frozen water and wood pulp he called Pykrete. Because apparently nothing says naval dominance like a warship you could technically lick. The admirals were fascinated. They funneled enormous resources into blueprints and even built a scaled-down prototype on a lake in Scotland. Bullets fired at the material just bounced off, which seemed promising. But there was a rather obvious catch. Keeping a ship the size of a mountain frozen in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is roughly as practical as keeping a snowman alive in a sauna. By 1943, with the war shifting and reality setting in, the whole concept quietly melted away. both literally and figuratively, becoming history's coldest and most expensive dead-end idea. 11. In the early 1400s, China absolutely dominated the seas. Their treasure fleet was a collection of ships so massive they made anything Europe had look like pool floats. These were floating palaces commanded by the legendary Admiral Zheng He, sailing across oceans and bringing back exotic treasures, including actual giraffes, which the Chinese court genuinely believed might be mythical unicorns. China was, without exaggeration, the most powerful maritime nation on the planet. Then a new emperor took power, surrounded himself with isolationist advisors, and they collectively looked at this magnificent fleet and decided it was a pointless extravagance. In one of the most baffling decisions in recorded history, they ordered every ship destroyed, burned the vessels, burned the navigation records, burned the maps. China voluntarily walked away from global dominance and slammed the door shut. It is the equivalent of landing on Mars and then announcing you are canceling the space program because staying home sounds nicer. 12. Catherine the Great of Russia was heading out on a tour of her newly acquired southern territories, and her partner Potemkin had one job: make it look good. The problem was the region was an absolute wasteland, so Potemkin pulled off one of history's most audacious scams. He built entire fake villages, just the front walls of buildings, propped up from behind with wooden supports like a theater set. He paid local peasants to stand out front, smile, wave, and pretend to be thriving and well-fed as the Empress sailed past on the river. The moment her boat rounded the bend, workers tore the whole facade down, hauled it downstream, and reassembled it at the next stop for another performance the following day. It was an insanely expensive, physically exhausting, and impressively creative lie, all designed to make one man look competent in front of his girlfriend. The original "fake it until you make it" scaled up to an entire country. 13. After the nightmare of World War I, France decided the smartest possible move was building the most expensive defensive barrier ever conceived. They called it the Maginot Line. This was not just a wall with some barbed wire. It was a fully equipped underground fortress network complete with air conditioning, internal railways, and living quarters comfortable enough that they probably had room service. Every inch of it was designed to be completely impenetrable from a frontal attack. A flawless defensive masterpiece. On paper. When World War II actually arrived, the Germans took one look at this billion-dollar barricade and simply went around it. They drove their tanks through the Ardennes forest and bypassed the whole thing entirely. It was the military equivalent of building the world's most advanced lock on your front door while leaving every window wide open. All that money, all that engineering, turned into the most luxurious, irrelevant structure in military history. 14. A full century before the modern Channel Tunnel was built, a Victorian engineer with big ambitions actually started digging a passage under the English Channel to connect Britain and France. Using a state-of-the-art boring machine, he managed to carve out roughly a mile of tunnel beneath the seabed. It was a genuinely impressive feat of engineering for the era. Then the British military completely lost its composure. Generals became absolutely convinced that France would use the tunnel as a secret invasion route, probably imagining columns of French soldiers storming out of a hole in the English countryside while everyone was busy playing cricket. The paranoia reached such a fever pitch that the government ordered the project killed and the tunnel filled with concrete. They torched a massive investment and set back cross-channel transportation by an entire century, all because they could not handle the idea of their neighbors having easy access to the front door. 15. Right after World War II ended, Britain, still clinging to its imperial ambitions, decided the empire absolutely needed a reliable supply of peanuts. This gave birth to the East African groundnut scheme. Bulldozers, heavy tractors, and optimistic planners rolled into Tanganyika with grand visions of endless peanut fields. What they found instead was soil so brutally hard it made concrete jealous, and a rainy season that turned everything into knee-deep swamp. They had brought completely wrong equipment for the terrain, which is a bit like packing a surfboard for a trip to the Sahara. Over 50 million pounds, north of $2.5 billion in today's money, got poured into chasing peanuts that flatly refused to grow. Machinery broke down and rusted at record speed, while local animals happily feasted on whatever scraps of British ambition were left lying around. By 1951, the entire operation was abandoned, leaving nothing behind but dead tractors and a masterclass in terrible planning. 16. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were the undisputed champions of going way too far. Their obsession with the afterlife drove them to construct enormous pointed mountains of stone as personal tombs. The Great Pyramid alone required the labor of a small nation working for decades, all to build the world's most aggressive "Do Not Disturb" sign. For a massive stretch of Egyptian history, a significant portion of the entire economy was essentially dedicated to stacking blocks for one deceased ruler. It was the ultimate vanity project, a way to flex on every future generation from the other side of death. And when you think about it, it really was a pyramid scheme in the most literal sense. One guy at the top gets a spectacular stone palace for eternity, and everybody else just gets exhaustion and a bill. The real kicker? After all that effort and expense, tomb robbers still broke in and cleaned the place out anyway. 18. The year is 1803, and Napoleon Bonaparte is in the middle of trying to conquer all of Europe, which turns out to be an incredibly expensive pastime. He is burning through cash at a terrifying rate. Meanwhile, across the ocean, President Thomas Jefferson just wants to buy the port of New Orleans, so American farmers can ship their grain without hassle. Jefferson sends his diplomats to France, carrying a modest offer of a few $1,000,000 for the city. Napoleon, presumably surrounded by invoices for artillery and military uniforms, looks at their offer and basically says, "Forget the city. How about I sell you everything?" He puts the entire Louisiana territory on the table, a landmass so enormous it instantly doubled the size of the United States. The American negotiators, who showed up to buy a front porch, suddenly walked out owning half a continent. It remains the greatest real estate bargain in human history, all because one ambitious French general desperately needed fast cash to fund his addiction to conquest. 19. During the 1630s, the people of the Netherlands collectively decided that the smartest possible investment was flowers. Not property, not precious metals, tulips, specifically tulips with fancy striped petals. The obsession escalated so fast that a single tulip bulb, which is essentially a small, unremarkable dirt onion you could crush underfoot, was trading for more than the price of a grand canal house in Amsterdam. Imagine people today selling their homes and draining their savings accounts to purchase one exceptionally attractive avocado. Everyone was a paper millionaire, probably strutting around with unbearable confidence. Then, almost overnight, the entire country seemed to snap out of a collective trance. People realized they had staked their financial futures on something a garden pest could destroy in an afternoon. The market collapsed with devastating speed, wiping out fortunes in hours. An entire nation's economy brought to its knees by decorative petals. Definitive proof that hype makes a truly terrible investment strategy. 20. 16th century Spain was essentially a country that hit the jackpot every single week for 100 years straight. They discovered such mind-boggling quantities of silver in the Americas that they ran out of ideas for what to do with it all. So they did the obvious thing. They bought absolutely everything. Endless wars, outrageously lavish cathedrals, and luxuries that would make a modern billionaire blush. But they skipped one critical lesson from basic economics. When you flood the market with an absurd amount of precious metal, that metal stops being precious. Spain dumped so much silver into Europe that it triggered catastrophic inflation across the entire continent. Prices exploded. Their seemingly infinite wealth became increasingly meaningless. They were so rich that they effectively made themselves and everyone around them poorer. It was a financial self-destruction of historic, continent-shaking proportions. 21. In the early 1900s, Germany looked at Britain's enormous Royal Navy and developed an intense case of jealousy. Their reaction was basically, "We need one of those except bigger and scarier." So they launched a massively expensive naval arms race. Germany sank a jaw-dropping portion of its national budget into constructing enormous, state-of-the-art battleships called dreadnoughts. These were the most impressive and intimidating warships on the planet. Here is the punchline, though. When World War I actually broke out, these incredibly costly ships spent most of the war sitting safely in harbors. They were deemed too expensive and too valuable to risk in actual combat. It was the equivalent of buying the most powerful sports car ever made and then refusing to drive it because you are terrified of a door ding. When the war ended, the Germans scuttled the entire fleet themselves. The most expensive rage quit in the history of naval warfare. 22. In 280 BC, King Pyrrhus of Epirus looked at the standard cavalry options and said, "Forget horses." He wanted war elephants. He sank an enormous fortune, the ancient equivalent of funding a space program, into acquiring, feeding, training, and transporting these giant tusked weapons of mass intimidation all the way to Italy. When the elephants charged into Roman battle lines, soldiers on the receiving end probably assumed the world was ending. But the Romans adapted fast. They dug concealed trenches and jabbed at the animals with long spears, turning an organized elephant assault into a panicked, chaotic stampede heading in every direction, including backwards. Pyrrhus technically won his battles, but stared at the bill afterwards and famously groaned that one more victory like this would ruin him completely. His superweapon had running costs comparable to a small kingdom. His treasury never recovered, proving that even in the ancient world, you simply cannot outspend a stubborn opponent forever. 23. During both World Wars, the United States ran into serious steel shortages, and someone in a planning room had a thought that should have stayed inside their head. What if we build ships out of concrete? And so, the Pyrrhusman fleet was born. Hulking vessels with stone and cement hulls that looked like something designed by cavemen with engineering degrees. Each ship cost roughly 30% more than a steel equivalent, crawled through the ocean at barely 10 knots on a good day, and burned through fuel at an embarrassing rate. They were less like combat-ready warships and more like floating apartment buildings with an identity crisis. Crews spent their voyages mopping up leaks and listening nervously for ominous cracking sounds every time a wave hit. After a handful of miserable trips, most of these concrete disasters were towed away to scrapyards or deliberately sunk to serve as artificial reefs. Millions spent, zero victories earned. 24. The Nazi regime had a serious addiction to so-called wonder weapons that were mostly just spectacular money pits. The V3 supergun might be the prime example. This was not a regular cannon. It was a 500-foot-long metal monstrosity buried deep inside a hillside in northern France. The idea was terrifying on paper. A weapon capable of launching hundreds of explosive shells per hour directly at London from across the Channel. It was a real-life supervillain weapon brought out of a blueprint and into concrete. But before this doomsday cannon could fire even one round, Allied intelligence discovered the hidden complex. Instead of sending spies, they simply dropped massive bunker-busting bombs right on top of it. The entire facility and everything inside were crushed into an extremely expensive pile of rubble and shattered ambitions. Millions upon millions wasted on a superweapon that never even got the chance to go bang. 25. The year is 1702. A Spanish admiral is sitting on a fleet absolutely loaded with silver hauled from the New World. Then a combined English and Dutch naval force catches him trapped inside a bay with no way out. A rational commander might have considered fighting or negotiating a surrender. This particular admiral, however, chose the most dramatic option available: total self-destruction. He essentially decided that if he could not keep the treasure, then nobody on the planet would have it. He ordered his own crews to set the entire fleet ablaze. An unthinkable fortune in silver and gold melted into the sea and sank to the ocean floor. The truly painful detail? The enemy still managed to board several ships and haul away a significant pile of loot before everything went under. It was the financial equivalent of winning the lottery and then lighting the ticket on fire because you did not want to deal with the paperwork. 26. The Siegfried Line was Nazi Germany's direct response to France's Maginot Line, turning the whole thing into the ultimate contest of whose pointless wall was more impressive. On paper, it looked absolutely fearsome. Thousands of concrete bunkers and rows of jagged anti-tank obstacles called Dragon's Teeth stretched across the landscape. Propaganda newsreels sold it as an impenetrable fortress that would stop any invasion cold. In practice, it was a disaster. The concrete was cheap and crumbling. The bunkers were damp, miserable, and poorly maintained. The weapons stored inside were mostly outdated surplus. When Allied forces finally reached the line, there was no dramatic, prolonged siege. They essentially shoved their way through it without much ceremony. It was less of a legendary defensive barrier and more of a very long, very crumbly, and astronomically expensive speed bump that barely slowed anyone down. 27. Some ideas sound brilliant right up until the moment you actually think them through. A powerful ancient Chinese emperor had an ambitious artistic vision. He wanted to create a vast golden sea of wheat fields stretching thousands of miles across the landscape, a breathtaking symbol of imperial prosperity. To make it happen, he forced millions of peasants to plant nothing but wheat across enormous swaths of the empire. They ignored crop rotation. They ignored what the soil could actually sustain. They just planted wheat in every direction as far as the eye could see. The results were catastrophic. The soil was completely drained of nutrients within seasons. Pests that thrived on wheat exploded in population and threw an unstoppable feast. Those beautiful golden miles quickly turned into barren, lifeless dust, directly triggering a devastating famine. A fortune spent creating a pretty picture that ended up starving the people it was supposed to inspire. 28. There is a classic American story about shrewd deal-making. In 1626, the Dutch supposedly purchased the entire island of Manhattan from the local natives for roughly $24 worth of trinkets and beads. We have been telling this story for centuries like it was some genius-level negotiation. But the actual details make it far more ridiculous. The specific group of natives who accepted the deal most likely did not even live on Manhattan. They were essentially visitors from a nearby area just passing through. So when a group of overdressed Dutchmen offered them a pile of shiny goods for land they had no real claim to, they probably could not believe their luck. It was less of a masterful business transaction and more like paying a stranger standing in a parking lot for a building he does not own, and then being surprised years later when nobody contests the sale. The Dutch did not make a genius deal. They stumbled into a multi-billion-dollar accident. 29. In 1856, the United States Congress concluded that horses simply were not tough enough for the harsh deserts of the American Southwest, so they allocated $30,000, well over $1 million today, to import 75 camels from the Ottoman Empire. Initially, these humped newcomers performed beautifully, hauling heavy loads through scorching heat and making the horses look completely pathetic by comparison. But the honeymoon ended fast. The cavalry horses absolutely panicked at the sight of these tall, lumpy, spitting creatures, stampeding in terror as if aliens had landed. Riders had no idea how to handle the camels, and handlers spent more time debating camel dietary preferences than actually getting work done. Then the Civil War erupted, military priorities shifted overnight, and the camel budget evaporated. The animals were auctioned off or simply released into the wild. There are stories that desert travelers reported spotting confused, wandering camels in the American Southwest for decades afterwards. 30. In 1939, the United States decided it wanted a presence in Antarctica, and to get there in style, they built one of the most absurdly ambitious vehicles ever conceived, the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. This machine was a 55-foot-long, 37-ton behemoth that looked like it rolled straight out of a science fiction movie. It had a built-in workshop, a full kitchen, sleeping quarters, and could even carry a small airplane strapped to its roof. It was the ultimate exploration machine, at least on paper. After spending a fortune constructing this beast, they shipped it to Antarctica with great fanfare. The moment it rolled onto the ice, reality hit hard. Its enormous, completely smooth tires, apparently designed for dry pavement rather than a frozen continent, sank straight into the snow. The thing had zero traction. It could not climb the gentlest slope. After a few humiliating attempts to make it move, this multi-million-dollar marvel was abandoned on the ice and slowly buried by snowdrifts, becoming what might be the most expensive and embarrassing piece of frozen junk on the planet. 31. During the 1950s, American military researchers became obsessed with a genuinely unhinged question. Could you turn pure sound into a weapon? They poured millions into developing massive acoustic cannons nicknamed death sound devices. The concept was a speaker system so devastatingly loud it could physically incapacitate enemy soldiers from a distance. Prototype rigs mounted on trucks and barges blasted test pulses that mostly succeeded in damaging the hearing of the engineers running the experiments rather than any actual targets. The weapon had all the tactical precision of an entire drum kit tumbling down a staircase at maximum volume. Wind conditions, humidity, and basic physics all conspired to make the whole thing completely unreliable in any real-world scenario. By the late 1960s, after budgets had ballooned into the tens of millions, the program was quietly buried. Definitive proof that sometimes the worst weapon is the one your own team cannot operate without needing medical attention. 32. King Louis XIV of France, the self-proclaimed center of the universe, decided that his living situation needed to reflect just how much better he believed he was than every other human being alive. So he built Versailles. This was not a palace. It was an act of war against modesty. Rooms full of solid silver furniture, a hall lined with mirrors so he could admire himself from literally every angle. Gardens so sprawling you would need a map and a full day's supply of food just to walk across them. The cost was staggering, consuming a massive portion of France's entire national income year after year. While Louis was strolling through his perfectly maintained grounds, ordinary French citizens were struggling to put food on the table. This extreme, decades-long spending spree built up so much resentment among the population that it became one of the direct causes of the French Revolution. The moment the people of France decided their king had enjoyed his last extravagant afternoon. 32 decisions that burned through more money than most countries will ever see. And not one person stopped to say, hey, maybe this is a terrible idea. Now, a challenge. Pick any two from this list. You get a time machine and can only prevent one. The other one has to happen. Which one do you save, and which one do you sacrifice? Drop your pair in the comments. Like this video if your jaw dropped at least once, and subscribe, because next time it gets even wilder.